This is my research presentation on Muslims in Bulgaria and their perception and integration. To give some history, originally, what we now know as Bulgaria was under Ottoman control, was part of the Ottoman Empire. For over 500 years, the native population of Bulgarians, while having a distinct language, were under Turkish rule, and Turkish citizens were prioritized and given better treatment. The Bulgarian identity then arose in opposition to Turkish or Ottoman rule. That instilled a strong ethnic nationalism that still separates the cultures. In fact, we often talk about just Bulgarians and Turks, but there are the Turkish, Pomak, and Roma ethnic minorities. Then usually, since they all were Islamic and all part of the empire more or less compared to the Bulgarian nationals, they are all usually lumped together. And even in census data, Pomaks are not distinguished, even though they are a distinct ethnic minority. After the revolution and after World War II, Bulgaria was communist, and the communists put harsh restrictions on ethnic identities and ethnic minorities. From 1944 to 1984, they did resettlement practices, and they did what they literally called unveiling, which was banning any Turkish garbs, banning the use of everything from the Turkish pants to the headdress, not just the headdress, but the cap that we in the U.S. associate with Shriners, actually, but that Muslim cap that was Turkish in origin was also banned. They would also destroy settlements of the Roma and Pomak, and then force them to move into urban environments. Religion in general was suppressed, but specifically for Islam, because the Turkish population for the Soviets, they didn't want anything going on like what happened with Turkey and Cyprus, where the Turks might instill revolt or revolution against the Soviets. There was an era called the process of rebirth. It is a blemish and a harsh cultural memory for the Turks that still live there. It was a push by the communist government that completely banned Islam, no Qurans, no building of new mosques, and in fact, you couldn't speak the Turkish language. You could in your home, quietly, but you couldn't meet and gather in public and speak their native tongue. They had to speak Bulgarian. At this point, they started changing Bulgarian names, and people fled, some to the mountains where the practice hadn't started yet because it began in the cities, and then later some even fled to Turkey. There were over 800,000 names that were changed in this, and over 200,000 people fled to Turkey. The Islamic holy days, Ramadan, like the month of Ramadan, they weren't allowed to be celebrated, and they tried to move as many people as they could into Soviet life, working in factories and creating a homogenous culture. In the modern context, we actually see some interesting numbers here. So for refugee migration in the pre-migrant crisis, so from 1993 to 2011, Bulgaria had around 20,000 refugee applications, plus a few thousand asylum applications. They had people seeking asylum from the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, the problems that happened in Armenia and the Armenian genocide, and Iran. Over a third of these were not completed, roughly 36%. Now, as part of that, Bulgaria is often a place of transit. So someone is fleeing from Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran. They go through Turkey and into Bulgaria, and Bulgaria is often the first European country they end up in. So many people start the application process, but might go with a caravan or catch a ride or hire someone to move them into another country and then never complete the process. Because of this, you actually see a high number of these applications. The ones that were completed are accepted often. In the current migrant crisis, Lisa Stiegel, she did a report on the recognition rates for asylum. And Bulgaria actually had the highest recognition rate, 94.1% acceptance of asylum requests. Now, she equated that could be an inflation of numbers and that Bulgaria had some tensions with migrants, which was true. There were some border clashes and some problems with migrants. But if we look at that too, if they're just reporting the number of completed asylum requests that they accepted, it could be a similar situation to what we saw in the previous slide, where some people started the application, never finished it, but those that did finish the application were approved. I think an interesting thing is that Bulgaria does have areas of high Muslim population already, and for that, integrating someone who was either Turkish or Arab in origin into a region that has a high Muslim population already would be a lot easier process than moving someone into a British village or a German town. They also have Bulgaria has a high level of economic integration for their immigrants. They have a policy of favoring skilled labor and degrees and tradesmen. In the 2010s, the employment rate and average income of immigrants was higher than Bulgarian citizens. So they were actually getting, instead of a brain drain that we often talk about, they were actually getting a brain dump. They were more people coming in with degrees and finished education and who are already trained in a skill coming into the country. Now, to contrast that, because that's general immigration of anybody immigrating into the country. However, Bulgarian Turks and Roma are more likely to live in rural areas and be below the poverty line. 63% of the Turks and 46.2% of the Roma live in those rural areas. And when you look at the education gaps, when we talk about true integration, we look at education gaps. Only 2.4% of the Turkish population over 20 attended a university. Less than 19% finished their post-high school test, which is somewhat racist and somewhat discriminatory because the post-high school test, one of the highest parts is the Bulgarian language. You cannot pass it without having a high skill in Bulgarian. This creates tremendous inequality going forward for those people who don't have their final degree. They've finished high school, but they don't have their certificate, and therefore makes it harder in the job market, and they're more likely to be stuck below the poverty line. This map is very intriguing. You'll actually see there are multiple areas where over half of the population is Turkish. Now, this actually gives them some power because each region has their own elections. Those elections then put people into their Congress, and having regions where you have 50% of the population nearly guarantees that at least someone from those provinces, their representatives, are going to value Turkish rights and value the rights of their Muslim minority. In fact, there's a specific party, even though ethnic parties are technically banned, the MRF party is almost entirely, or over 70% of the Muslims who vote for the MRF. That actually grew over the course of 10 years. They went from having about half to about in the upper 70s now. It actually started while we were still under communist rule, as part of the eastern part of Bulgaria, going against the heavy-handed practices that they were using against Muslims, but they did start as a secular party that just happened to represent minorities. Going to this territorial administration, unlike how the US and Western Europe have it with their states, they have territorial governance much like a communist setup. So, as we said, those regional areas give Muslim representation, and the regional governors institute the national law, but also take care with high executive power over their region, which lets them specifically work towards the ethnic populations of their region, whether that is more Turkish, whether that's more Roma. When we go into identity and citizenship, Western nation states, we talk about multiculturalism and active citizenship, but the idea of a citizen isn't always the same. In the US, we have rights of the soil, rights of the blood. That's not necessarily how Europe has it. France has a different view of citizenship. Specifically in Bulgaria, if you have a Bulgarian parent, you're automatically a citizen. But if you're born to non-Bulgarians and you're born in Bulgaria, you are not automatically a citizen. Your parents will choose whether they will take the citizenship of their home country or whether you will not take citizenship of your home country and be Bulgarian. Again, part of this idea of what is Bulgarian, who is Bulgarian, we look at language. So here we see that in Bulgaria, 97% of people surveyed in this Pew Research study said that being able to speak Bulgarian is important to being truly Bulgarian. This is part of the nationalism from the post-Ottoman history of Bulgaria, but in a more recent development, North Macedonia became a nation state just this past year and a half. And they have a very similar history to Bulgaria and a very similar language. Part of the distinction of Bulgarian is they need to separate themselves from Northern Macedonian. Also, the wanting to be Bulgarian, wanting to speak Bulgarian, again, goes back to throwing off the Turkish yoke, throwing off the what they felt was oppression by an Islamic caliphate, and wanting to be their own nation with their own national identity. They also have a strong Eastern Orthodox population. In fact, the same Pew Research showed that the number of people who were Eastern Orthodox had actually gone up. It was staying relatively stable, but it was a 2% gain. So we see that Bulgaria has 75% of the population as Eastern Orthodox or Greek Orthodox. We then see 16% as other, roughly 10% of that is Muslim. That's a very high percentage for a European country, but as we showed on the map, it is regionalized, where you get some provinces that are 50% or more. And this actually has led to, again, a separation of the cultures because they're not integrating, they're not forced integration. It's not a melting pot situation, but rather regionalized. This is interesting. We see a study about the attitude of Bulgarians towards foreigners. When polled, around 60% had a negative view of Turkish people, Turkish foreigners, and even higher, around the 63% negative view of Arabs. That's very high and very concerning, but it also, again, goes to who is a foreigner. Do we know if they mean a Turk, or do they mean someone from Turkey? So someone who is ethnically Turkish, or someone who is immigrating from Turkey into the country. That would be a thing I'd want to dig deeper into that and see how the exact question was worded. When we look at current social integration, there's two quotes from two different authors here. At a personal, private level, Christians, Muslims, Turks, and Bulgarians live peacefully. So yes, they do work together. They do live together. 87% of Turks said they were happy to be in the same country as their Bulgarian neighbors. But when you look at marriage, when you look at actually melding of cultures, only 7.5% of Bulgarians and 40% of Turks could imagine themselves marrying into the opposite group. There's very little intermarriage at all between the cultures, and part of that is the heavy religious. It's very hard for a Greek Orthodox and a Muslim to come together. Having that joint wedding is something that would be very hard to work out, and it's not part of the culture there. You either, both people become Greek Orthodox, both people become Muslim. There's not a way to integrate those two successfully that they've found. And then a separate one here is the quote, "As long as anti-Turkish and anti-Muslim stereotypes persist in Bulgarian society, ethnic tensions cannot be dismissed." And this is true in the history, in what they learn in school when they learn about Bulgarian history. They learn about the oppression, they learn about it, and it's all from Bulgarian perspective. There's very little in what they're taught from the Islamic perspective. So those same things get ingrained in that racism, whether it's overt or whether it's subtle, gets ingrained in how they're taught. Much like here in the U.S., how we're taught with Native Americans, and we're not taught from their perspective. We're taught about manifest destiny. For the Bulgarians, it's them rising up against the Turks, and that's what they learn. And that quote was from Ragaru. And that's my report. Thank you very much.